The sound of shattering glass cut through the manor like a scream, followed immediately by shouts and the thunder of running footsteps. Edmund's face went pale, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time Charlotte had ever witnessed. Whatever carefully orchestrated plan he had been executing was clearly falling apart. "Stay here," Edmund commanded, his voice sharp with panic as he moved toward the library door. "Do not leave this room under any circumstances. Do you understand me?" Charlotte nodded, though her father was already unlocking the door and rushing into the hallway. She heard his voice joining the cacophony of shouts and commands that now filled the manor, but she couldn't make out individual words over the chaos. The sound of more breaking glass echoed from somewhere in the east wing, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned. Unable to resist her natural curiosity despite her father's explicit orders, Charlotte crept to one of the library windows that offered a partial view of the east wing. What she saw made her blood run cold. Men in dark clothing were systematically searching the grounds with flashlights, their movements professional and coordinated. These weren't the business associates who had been meeting with her father earlier. These were people with an entirely different agenda. The manor's security system began blaring, its shrill alarm adding another layer to the chaos. Charlotte had never heard the system activated before, and its harsh electronic screech seemed to emphasize how completely their normally ordered world had been turned upside down. Red emergency lights began flashing in the hallway outside the library, casting eerie shadows through the gap under the door. Charlotte's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Were they being robbed? Had her father's mysterious business dealings attracted the wrong kind of attention? Or was this something even more sinister? The precision of the search outside suggested this wasn't a random crime. Someone was looking for something specific, and they knew exactly where to look. The library door burst open without warning, causing Charlotte to jump away from the window. But instead of her father, a stranger entered. A tall man in a dark suit with cold eyes that seemed to catalog everything in the room within seconds. He was followed by another man carrying what looked like electronic equipment. "Miss Whitmore," the first man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Charlotte couldn't place. "My name is Viktor Kozlov. I represent certain interests that have been conducting business with your father. I'm afraid there's been a complication that requires your cooperation." Charlotte's throat felt dry as she tried to process this development. Her father had been doing business with these people, whoever they were, and now they were in her home, treating her like a prisoner in her own library. The way Victor spoke suggested that her cooperation wasn't really optional. "I don't know what business you're talking about," Charlotte said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I'm not involved in my father's affairs." Victor smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Oh, but you are involved, Miss Whitmore. More than you realize. Your father has been sharing sensitive information with our organization for several years now. Information that has proven quite valuable to our operations. Unfortunately, recent developments have made it necessary for us to secure all potential security risks." The second man was setting up his equipment near Charlotte's desk, and she realized with growing horror that he was preparing some kind of recording device. Whatever these people wanted from her, they intended to document it. The implications made her stomach churn with dread. "You see," Victor continued, settling into one of the library's leather chairs as if he owned the place, "your father has accumulated certain debts to our organization. Not financial debts. We have no interest in his money. Information debts. He has promised us access to government contracts, insider knowledge about regulatory changes, details about his competitors' operations. For years, this arrangement has been mutually beneficial." Charlotte's world tilted as the implications of Victor's words sank in. Her father wasn't just a successful businessman, he was some kind of information broker, selling sensitive data to what sounded like criminal organizations. Everything she had believed about their family's success was built on a foundation of lies and possibly treason. "However," Victor went on, his tone becoming more menacing, "recent events have made our continued partnership problematic. Your father's name has come to the attention of certain federal investigators who are asking uncomfortable questions about his business practices. This creates exposure that we cannot tolerate." The chaos in the manor was beginning to subside, but Charlotte could still hear voices and movement throughout the house. She wondered where her father was now, whether he was safe, and what role Vivian and Victoria played in all of this. Had they known about Edmund's illegal activities? Or were they as ignorant as Charlotte had been? "What does this have to do with me?" Charlotte asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Victor's smile widened, and Charlotte noticed that his canine teeth were unusually sharp. "Your father has informed us of your intellectual capabilities, your curiosity about his business, your correspondence with that law professor, your interest in social justice. These traits make you a significant liability to our organization's security." Charlotte's blood turned to ice. They knew about Professor Morrison. They knew about her secret plans to apply to law school. They had been watching her, monitoring her activities, treating her like a threat to be managed. The violation of her privacy felt almost as terrifying as the physical danger she was clearly facing. "We have developed a solution," Victor continued, "that will address both your father's debt to us and the security risk you represent. You are going to help us demonstrate to your father the consequences of failing to honor his commitments to our organization." The second man finished setting up his equipment and nodded to Victor. Charlotte could see a red light blinking on what was clearly a video camera, indicating that whatever happened next would be recorded. The thought of her suffering being documented for some twisted purpose made her feel physically ill. "I want to see my father," Charlotte said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "If he's made agreements with you, then he should be the one dealing with the consequences, not me." Victor laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "Oh, but you misunderstand the nature of consequences, Miss Whitmore. The most effective way to ensure someone's cooperation is to threaten what they value most, and despite his many flaws, your father does seem to value his daughter's well-being." The library door opened again, and Charlotte's heart sank as Vivienne was pushed into the room by another dark-suited man. Her younger sister looked terrified but unharmed, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her eyes wide with fear. Seeing Vivian in the same predicament made the reality of their situation even more stark. "Charlotte!" Vivian cried out, rushing toward her sister. "What's happening?" "These men just grabbed me from my room and wouldn't tell me anything." Charlotte wrapped her arms around Vivian, feeling a surge of protective instinct despite their complicated relationship. Whatever her sister's flaws, she didn't deserve to be caught up in their father's criminal activities. Neither of them had asked to be born into a family built on lies and corruption. "How touching," Victor observed sarcastically. "Family solidarity in the face of adversity. Your father will appreciate seeing this when we show him the recording." Charlotte's mind was working frantically, trying to find some way out of their situation. The library had only one entrance, and it was now blocked by armed men. The windows were too high to provide an escape route, and even if they could somehow break the glass, the drop to the ground below would likely result in serious injury or death. "What exactly do you want us to do?" Charlotte asked, hoping to buy time while she looked for options. Victor gestured toward the camera. "We want you to deliver a message to your father. You're going to explain to him that his failure to honor his commitments to our organization has consequences for the people he cares about most. You're going to beg him to do whatever we ask, to provide us with whatever information we require, without question or hesitation." Charlotte felt bile rise in her throat at the thought of being forced to participate in her own family's extortion. The idea of begging her father to comply with these criminals' demands was repugnant, but the alternative, whatever these people were capable of doing to her and Vivian, might be even worse. "And if we refuse?" Charlotte asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Victor's expression grew cold. "Then we will demonstrate to your father what happens when people become security risks to our organization. The demonstration will be memorable." Vivienne began crying, the sound of her sobs filling the library. Charlotte had never seen her sister so frightened, and it broke her heart to realize how helpless they both were in this situation. Their wealth, their social status, their family connections, none of it mattered when faced with people who operated outside the boundaries of civilized society. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway caught everyone's attention. Charlotte could hear her father's voice, raised in anger, getting closer to the library. Whatever negotiations or confrontations had been taking place elsewhere in the manor, Edmund was apparently being brought to witness whatever Victor had planned for his daughters. "Ah," Victor said with satisfaction. "It appears your father is about to join us." This will make our demonstration much more effective if he can watch in real time. Charlotte's desperation reached a new level, as she realized their situation was about to get even worse. Having to perform this humiliation in front of their father would add another layer of psychological torture to whatever physical threats they were facing. She had to find a way to protect herself and Vivienne, but her options seemed to be narrowing by the minute. The door opened again, and Edmund entered, flanked by two more of Victor's associates. Charlotte was shocked by her father's appearance. His face was bruised, his expensive suit torn, and there was blood on his shirt. Whatever had been happening in the rest of the manor, Edmund had clearly been on the receiving end of significant violence. "Father!" Vivienne cried out, starting toward him before being roughly grabbed by one of the guards. Edmund's eyes met Charlotte's across the room, and she saw something there she had never seen before. Genuine remorse. Not the calculated regret of a businessman who had made a poor investment, but the deep, soul-crushing regret of a father who realized his choices had doomed his children. "I'm sorry," Edmund whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, girls. I never meant for this to happen." Victor stood up, clearly enjoying the family reunion he had orchestrated. How touching. "Now that we're all together, we can begin the real business of the evening. Mr. Whitmore, your daughters are going to help us send a message to anyone else who might be tempted to renege on their commitments to our organization." Charlotte felt the walls of the library closing in around her. Whatever was about to happen would change their lives forever, assuming they survived it. She looked around the room one last time, taking in the thousands of books that had been her refuge, the comfortable chairs where she had spent countless hours reading and dreaming of a different life, the desk where she had written letters to Professor Morrison about her hopes for the future. All of that was gone now, swept away by the revelation of her father's criminal activities, and the arrival of people who treated human lives as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. Charlotte realized that even if they somehow survived the night, nothing would ever be the same again. Victor nodded to the man operating the camera, and the red recording light began blinking more rapidly. Whatever was about to happen would be preserved forever, a permanent record of the moment the Whitmore family's carefully constructed world collapsed into chaos and violence. "Now then," Victor said, his voice taking on a ceremonial quality that made Charlotte's skin crawl, "let us begin." The red light of the camera cast an ominous glow across the library as Victor positioned himself behind Edmund's chair. Charlotte could see her father's hands shaking as he gripped the armrests, his knuckles white with tension. The man who had controlled every aspect of their lives now looked broken and defeated, a shadow of the commanding presence he had always projected. "Mr. Whitmore," Victor began, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, "you understand why we're here. For 3 years, you have provided our organization with valuable intelligence about government contracts, regulatory changes, and your competitors' strategies. This information has been worth millions to our operations." Edmund nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his daughters rather than on Victor. Charlotte could see the weight of his choices reflected in his expression, years of justifying increasingly dangerous compromises that had led them all to this moment. She wondered when it had started, what had first tempted her father to cross the line from legitimate business into whatever dark world Victor represented. However, Victor continued, beginning to pace behind Edmund's chair like a predator circling wounded prey. "Recent federal investigations have made your position untenable. Agent Sarah Chen from the Financial Crimes Unit has been asking very specific questions about your business practices. Questions that suggest someone has been providing her with information about our arrangement." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat at the mention of a federal agent. The implications were staggering. If the FBI was investigating her father's activities, then the criminal exposure went far beyond simple corporate espionage. This was a matter of national security, potentially involving foreign intelligence services or domestic terrorism financing. "I don't know anything about federal investigations," Edmund said, his voice hoarse. "I've been careful, just as we agreed. All our communications have been through the established channels. All payments have been properly laundered through the offshore accounts." Victor stopped pacing and placed a hand on Edmund's shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly but carried an unmistakable threat. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you've grown careless in your old age." Perhaps you've confided in someone you shouldn't have. Perhaps one of your daughters has overheard conversations they shouldn't have overheard. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine as Victor's gaze settled on her. The implication was clear. They suspected that she or Vivian had somehow compromised their father's operation. The thought was absurd. Neither sister had known anything about Edmund's illegal activities until tonight, but trying to convince these people of their innocence seemed futile. "My daughters know nothing about our business," Edmund said firmly, showing the first flash of his old authority. "They've never been involved in any aspect of my operations." Victor smiled coldly. "Really? Because our surveillance suggests otherwise. Charlotte, for instance, has been corresponding with Professor Helena Morrison at Yale University Law School. Professor Morrison, as it happens, has been consulting with the FBI on financial crimes cases. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Charlotte's world tilted as the accusation hit her. Professor Morrison was working with the FBI? The woman who had been encouraging her to apply to law school, who had seemed so supportive of her intellectual ambitions, was actually a federal investigator? Or was Victor lying, trying to create suspicion and paranoia within the family? "That's impossible," Charlotte said, finding her voice despite the fear that threatened to choke her. "Professor Morrison is just a law professor. I've been writing to her about my interest in constitutional law. She doesn't know anything about our family's business because I don't know anything about our family's business." Victor's laugh was devoid of humor. "You really have no idea how deep your father's activities go, do you? The information he's been providing us doesn't just concern his own company. He's been gathering intelligence on defense contractors, technology firms, pharmaceutical companies, any business that might be useful to our clients' interests." The scope of her father's betrayal was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just corporate espionage or insider trading. Edmund had been conducting what amounted to economic warfare against his own country. The contracts he mentioned, the regulatory information, the competitor intelligence, all of it could be used to give foreign powers or criminal organizations significant advantages over American businesses and government agencies. "The beauty of Edmund's position," Victor continued, clearly enjoying the family's growing horror, "is that his social connections gave him access to information that would be impossible to obtain through conventional intelligence gathering. Board meetings, private dinners, charity events, all opportunities to collect data that our clients find invaluable." As time in a section came to us in one of the most Sigorished towns. Upcoming projects to be restored. The country club gatherings where loose tongues and expensive wine led to casual revelations about sensitive matters. Her father had turned their entire social life into an intelligence operation. But now, Victor said, his tone becoming more dangerous, that access is compromised. Federal agents are asking questions. Business associates are becoming suspicious. Your usefulness to our organization has come to an end, Mr. Whitmore. Edmund's composure finally cracked completely. "Please," he whispered, tears beginning to stream down his face. "Whatever you want, whatever it takes to end this, I'll do it. But leave my daughters alone. They're innocent in all of this." Victor's expression didn't soften at Edmund's plea. "Innocence is a luxury we can't afford, Mr. Whitmore. Your daughters represent potential security risks that must be addressed. Charlotte's intelligence and curiosity make her dangerous. Vivian's social connections could prove problematic if she starts asking the wrong questions." Charlotte felt a surge of desperate determination. These people were planning to harm or kill them simply because they might someday pose a threat to their operations. The casual way Victor discussed eliminating security risks suggested that murder was just another business tool to his organization. "There has to be another way," Charlotte said, stepping forward despite the guns trained on her. "You want to ensure our silence? Fine. We'll disappear. We'll leave the country, change our names, start new lives somewhere you'll never have to worry about us." Victor considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "Disappearing people is surprisingly difficult in the modern world, Miss Whitmore. Digital footprints, facial recognition software, international banking regulations. There are too many ways for someone to resurface unexpectedly. No, I'm afraid we require a more permanent solution." The matter-of-fact way he discussed their murder made Charlotte's stomach churn, but it also clarified their situation completely. These people had no intention of letting any of the Whitmores survive the night. Whatever they had planned, it would end with the entire family dead and their bodies disposed of in a way that would make their disappearance look like an accident or voluntary departure. Vivienne had been quietly sobbing throughout the conversation, but now she looked up with the expression of pure terror. "Charlotte," she whispered, "what are we going to do?" Before Charlotte could answer, the sound of sirens began echoing across the estate grounds. Distant at first but growing steadily louder, the wailing of multiple emergency vehicles approaching Willowbrook Manor. Victor's confident expression faltered for the first time since entering the library. "What is that?" Victor demanded, grabbing Edmund by the shoulder. Edmund looked as surprised as everyone else. "I don't know. I didn't call anyone." One of Victor's men rushed to the library windows and peered out through the heavy drapes. "Police cars," he reported tersely. "At least 6 vehicles, maybe more. They're surrounding the main gate." Victor cursed in what sounded like Russian, his carefully controlled demeanor cracking under pressure. How did they know? Who called them? Charlotte's mind raced with possibilities. Had one of the dismissed staff members seen something suspicious and contacted authorities? Had a neighbor heard the commotion and called for help? Or was this connected to the federal investigation Victor had mentioned? Had Agent Chen and her team been monitoring the situation more closely than anyone realized? "It doesn't matter how they found out," Victor said, his voice becoming sharper and more urgent. "What matters is containing this situation before it spirals completely out of control." He turned to his men and began issuing rapid instructions in a mixture of English and what Charlotte assumed was Russian. She caught fragments about establishing a perimeter, securing the entrances, and preparing for a siege situation. The casual discussion of murder had been replaced by military-style tactical planning. "This complicates things significantly," Victor admitted, turning back to the Whitmore family. "We had planned to make your deaths look accidental, a murder-suicide perhaps, or a tragic home invasion. But with law enforcement already involved, we'll need to adapt our approach." The sirens were getting closer now, and Charlotte could see flashing lights beginning to reflect off the manor's windows. Whatever was happening outside, it represented their first real hope for survival since this nightmare had begun. But she also realized that the presence of law enforcement might make Victor and his men more desperate, and therefore more dangerous. "Listen to me carefully," Victor said, his voice taking on a commanding tone. "We are going to tell the police that this is a family meeting that got heated. Edmund invited us here to discuss business matters, and tempers flared over a failed deal. No one has been harmed, no laws have been broken, and there's no reason for law enforcement to be concerned." Charlotte wanted to scream at the absurdity of Victor's plan. Did he really think they could just walk away from kidnapping and terrorizing a family because the police arrived unexpectedly? But she also realized that their survival might depend on playing along with his charade, at least until they could find a way to communicate the truth to the authorities outside. "If anyone deviates from this story," Victor continued, "if anyone suggests that this is anything more than a business disagreement, then we will resume our original plan the moment law enforcement leaves. Are we clear?" Edmund nodded immediately, his fear making him eager to agree to anything that might protect his daughters. Vivienne was still too terrified to speak, but she managed a shaky nod when Victor's gaze fell on her. Charlotte hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to refuse to cooperate with these criminals. But she also realized that this might be their only chance to survive long enough to expose the truth. If they could somehow get word to the police about what was really happening, Victor's organization might be brought to justice. "I understand," Charlotte said finally, though every word felt like swallowing poison. Victor smiled, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Excellent. Remember, we are all friends here. Business associates who had a minor disagreement that got out of hand. Nothing more serious than hurt feelings and wounded pride." The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the estate grounds, followed by shouted commands and the crunch of boots on gravel. Charlotte estimated that at least a dozen officers had arrived, possibly more. The response seemed disproportionate to whatever had initially brought them to the manor, which suggested they might know more about the situation than Victor realized. One of Victor's men positioned himself near the library entrance, his hand inside his jacket where Charlotte assumed he was carrying a weapon. The others took up positions around the room that would allow them to control the family while maintaining the illusion of a casual business meeting. "Remember," Victor said one final time. "We are all friends here." Charlotte nodded again, but her mind was already working on ways to signal the truth to the officers outside. She had one chance to expose Victor's operation and save her family, but she would need to be extremely careful about how she did it. One wrong move could trigger the violence that Victor was temporarily restraining. The sound of heavy footsteps approached the library door, and Charlotte held her breath as she prepared for what might be their last hope for survival. Some she recognized as belonging to family, friends, and business associates, but others were unfamiliar. One particularly ominous black SUV remained parked in the driveway for hours, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. Evening approached with Charlotte still confined to the library. Margaret brought her dinner on a silver tray, but the older woman's obvious nervousness made eating difficult. When Charlotte tried to question her about the day's events, Margaret simply shook her head and hurried away, clearly under strict instructions not to discuss anything. As darkness fell, the manor took on an entirely different atmosphere. The usual evening sounds, servants going about their duties, family members moving through the halls, the gentle hum of normal domestic life, were replaced by an oppressive silence. Charlotte realized that most of the staff had been dismissed for the day, leaving only essential personnel. Even Victoria and Vivian seemed to have disappeared, their usual chatter and movement conspicuously absent. Around 10 o'clock, Charlotte heard her father's voice in the hallway outside the library, speaking in low, urgent tones with someone she didn't recognize. She crept closer to the door, pressing her ear against the heavy wood, but could only make out fragments of the conversation. "Absolutely no one can know about this. Consequences would be catastrophic. Eliminate any potential problems before they develop." The conversation moved away down the hall, leaving Charlotte with more questions than answers. She returned to her desk, pretending to read, but her mind raced with possibilities. What could be so serious that it required this level of secrecy? What kind of business was her father involved in that necessitated such extreme precautions? The grandfather clock in the main foyer chimed 11 times, its deep resonance echoing through the manor's halls. Charlotte could see that Detective Morrison wasn't buying the explanation. His experienced eyes were noting details that contradicted Edmund's story. The obvious fear in Vivian's posture, the bruises on Edmund's face, the way Victor's men were positioned around the room like guards rather than business associates. "International contracts," Detective Morrison repeated slowly. "That's interesting, Mr. Whitmore, because we've been investigating some irregularities in your business dealings. Federal agents have been asking questions about your involvement with certain foreign entities." Victor's composure finally showed visible cracks. The detective's words confirmed that law enforcement knew far more about Edmund's activities than anyone had realized. This wasn't a random response to a disturbance call. This was part of an ongoing investigation that had reached a critical point. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to," Edmund said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Charlotte could see that her father was trapped between two impossible choices: tell the truth and face Victor's immediate retribution, or maintain the lie and risk federal prosecution. Detective Morrison stepped further into the library, and Charlotte noticed that he positioned himself where he could see everyone in the room while keeping his back to a wall. His tactical awareness suggested military or law enforcement training that went beyond typical police work. "Whitmore," Detective Morrison said suddenly, turning his attention to Charlotte. "Are you all right? You look like you might be in some distress." Charlotte felt Victor's eyes boring into her as she struggled with how to respond. This was her chance to signal for help, but she also knew that Victor had made it clear what would happen if she deviated from his script. The wrong word could trigger violence that would put everyone in the room at risk. "I'm fine," Charlotte said carefully, but she let her voice waver slightly, hoping the detective would pick up on the subtle signal that all was not well. "It's just been a very long and stressful evening." Detective Morrison studied her face intently, and Charlotte could see that he was reading between the lines of her response. His next words confirmed that he understood more about the situation than he was letting on. "I imagine it has been stressful," he said meaningfully. "Sometimes business meetings can become quite intense, especially when they involve matters of national security." The phrase "national security" hit the room like a thunderbolt. Victor's hand moved slightly toward his jacket, and Charlotte saw the two uniformed officers tense in response. The careful balance that had been maintaining the illusion of a peaceful business meeting was beginning to collapse. "Detective," Victor said smoothly, but Charlotte could hear the strain in his voice. "I think there may be some confusion here. We are simply discussing import/export opportunities in Eastern Europe, nothing that would concern national security agencies." Detective Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Really? Because Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has been very interested in your import/export activities, Mr. Kozlov. Yes, we know who you are." Charlotte felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The police knew Victor's identity, which meant they had been monitoring his organization, but it also meant that the pretense of a peaceful resolution was over. Victor and his men were now cornered criminals with nothing left to lose. "I think it's time for everyone to be completely honest about what's been happening here tonight," Detective Morrison continued, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Mr. Whitmore, your cooperation with federal investigators could make a significant difference in how this situation resolves." Edmund looked like he was about to collapse under the weight of his impossible situation. Charlotte could see him calculating odds, trying to figure out which choice offered the best chance of survival for his daughters. The man who had always controlled every situation was now completely out of his depth. "Detective," Edmund said slowly, "I think I need to speak with my attorney before I say anything else." Victor's expression hardened at Edmund's refusal to maintain their charade. Charlotte could see him making rapid calculations about his own options. The recording equipment was still running, capturing everything that was being said. If the police seized that equipment, it would provide evidence of the entire conspiracy. "Actually," Victor said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "I think we've had enough conversation for one evening." He nodded to one of his men who moved toward the recording equipment. Detective Morrison immediately stepped forward to intercept him. "I'm going to need everyone to remain exactly where they are," Detective Morrison said firmly, his weapon now partially drawn. "This is now an active criminal investigation, and no one is leaving until we sort out exactly what's been happening here." The tension in the library reached a breaking point. Charlotte could see Victor weighing his options: surrender and face federal prosecution, or fight his way out and hope to escape before reinforcements arrived. The violent glint in his eyes suggested he was leaning toward the more desperate choice. "Charlotte," Detective Morrison said quietly, never taking his eyes off Victor, "I need you to tell me the truth about what's been happening here tonight. Are you and your sister in danger?" This was the moment Charlotte had been waiting for, her chance to expose the truth and potentially save their lives. But she also realized that speaking up would likely trigger the violence that everyone had been trying to avoid. Victor's men were armed and desperate, and the confined space of the library would turn any confrontation into a bloodbath. "Yes," Charlotte said clearly, her voice carrying across the room like a bell. "We are in danger. These men have been threatening to kill us. They've been extorting my father for information about government contracts and defense contractors. They're not business partners. They're criminals." Victor cursed viciously in Russian and reached for his weapon. Detective Morrison drew his gun completely, and the two uniformed officers did the same. Vivian screamed and dove behind one of the leather chairs while Edmund threw himself toward his daughters in a futile attempt to protect them. "Everyone drop your weapons now!" Detective Morrison shouted. "This building is surrounded by law enforcement officers." Victor's men hesitated, looking to their leader for guidance. Charlotte could see Victor calculating the odds of fighting their way out versus the certainty of federal prison if they surrendered. The calculation seemed to be taking too long, and she feared he would choose violence over capture. The sound of more footsteps in the hallway indicated that additional officers were entering the manor. Detective Morrison's claim about the building being surrounded was apparently true, which meant Victor's options were becoming more limited by the minute. "Victor," one of his men said urgently in heavily accented English, "we cannot fight our way out of this. Too many police. We need to surrender." Victor's face contorted with rage at the suggestion of surrender. "Surrender means life in American prison," he snarled. "I would rather die here." Charlotte realized with growing horror that Victor was preparing to go down fighting, regardless of how many people died in the process. His organization's activities were apparently serious enough that capture meant life imprisonment or worse, which made him willing to risk everything on a desperate escape attempt. "Mr. Kozlov," Detective Morrison said, his weapon trained on Victor's center mass. "You have 5 seconds to drop your weapon and surrender." After that, this becomes a much more difficult situation for everyone involved. Charlotte pressed herself against the library wall, pulling Vivienne with her as she tried to find cover behind the massive mahogany bookcases. Edmund had positioned himself between his daughters and Victor's men, finally showing the protective instincts that had been absent throughout his years of criminal activity. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight, its deep tones echoing through the manor like a death knell. Charlotte realized that this was the moment everything would be decided, whether Victor would surrender and face justice, or whether he would choose to take as many people with him as possible. "Time's up," Detective Morrison said grimly, and Charlotte closed her eyes as she prepared for the violence that seemed inevitable. But instead of gunshots, she heard the sound of weapons hitting the floor. Opening her eyes, she saw that Victor's men had apparently decided that survival was more important than loyalty to their leader. One by one, they were laying down their guns and raising their hands in surrender. Victor stood alone, his weapon still drawn, surrounded by police officers, and abandoned by his own men. The fury in his eyes was terrible to see, but Charlotte could also detect something else, the recognition that his criminal empire was finally coming to an end. "You think this ends anything?" Victor snarled at Detective Morrison. "You think arresting me will stop what we've set in motion? This organization has been operating for decades. We have people everywhere. In your government, in your military, in your intelligence agencies. You cannot stop us all." Detective Morrison smiled grimly. "Maybe not all of you, Mr. Kozlov. But we can start with you." The arrest of Victor Kozlov and his associates marked the beginning of the most intensive federal investigation in Connecticut's history. As Charlotte watched the handcuffed men being led away from Willowbrook Manor, she realized that their ordeal was far from over. If anything, the real battle was just beginning. Agent Sarah Chen arrived at the manor within an hour of the arrests, accompanied by a team of federal investigators who began systematically searching every room, every file cabinet, and every computer in the estate. Charlotte learned that the FBI had been building a case against her father's organization for over 2 years, using electronic surveillance, financial tracking, and human intelligence sources to map the entire network. The scope of Edmund's betrayal became clear over the following days as investigators revealed the full extent of his activities. For nearly a decade, he had been selling sensitive information to foreign intelligence services through Victor's organization. Defense contracts worth billions of dollars had been compromised, giving hostile nations critical advantages in military technology development. Corporate secrets had been stolen and sold to international competitors, undermining American businesses and costing thousands of jobs. Charlotte sat in the manor's dining room, now converted into a makeshift FBI command center, as Agent Chen explained the charges her father would be facing. Treason, espionage, conspiracy, racketeering. The list seemed endless, and each count carried the potential for decades in federal prison. Edmund had already agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation, in exchange for consideration in his daughter's sentencing, though Charlotte wasn't sure what crimes she and Vivienne had supposedly committed. "The good news," Agent Chen said, reviewing files spread across the mahogany table where the family had shared countless meals, "is that our investigation confirms you and your sister had no knowledge of your father's criminal activities. The correspondence we monitored between you and Professor Morrison was exactly what it appeared to be. Academic discussions about constitutional law and your interest in applying to law school." Charlotte felt a wave of relief wash over her. Professor Morrison had indeed been consulting with the FBI, but only as an expert witness in financial crimes cases. Their correspondence had been completely innocent, focused on Charlotte's genuine interest in pursuing legal education. The fact that Victor's organization had viewed it as suspicious said more about their paranoia than about any actual security risk. However, Agent Chen continued, her expression becoming more serious. "Your family's assets will be subject to federal forfeiture proceedings. The government will be seizing properties, accounts, and investments that were purchased with proceeds from criminal activities. Given the scope of your father's crimes, that includes virtually everything." The reality of their situation began to sink in. Willowbrook Manor, the vacation homes, the art collection, the trust funds that were supposed to secure their futures. All of it would be taken by the government. Charlotte and Vivienne would emerge from this scandal not just traumatized, but essentially penniless. The privileged life they had always taken for granted was disappearing as completely as if it had never existed. Vivienne had been largely catatonic since the night of the arrests, speaking only to answer direct questions from investigators. The revelation that their entire lives had been built on a foundation of treason and betrayal had shattered her worldview in ways that Charlotte was only beginning to understand. The sister who had once manipulated social situations with such skill now seemed unable to function in any social context at all. Margaret, the longtime housekeeper, had been one of the few staff members who remained loyal to the family through the investigation. She explained to Charlotte that most of the domestic employees had been dismissed immediately after the FBI raid, both for security reasons and because there was no longer money to pay their salaries. Victoria had fled to Switzerland within hours of Edmund's arrest, taking whatever portable assets she could carry and leaving her stepdaughters to face the consequences alone. "Miss Charlotte," Margaret said as they packed the few personal belongings the government would allow them to keep, "I want you to know that I never suspected anything about your father's business activities. If I had known what he was doing, I would have found a way to protect you and Miss Vivienne." Charlotte hugged the older woman, realizing that Margaret was one of the few people in her life who had genuinely cared about her well-being rather than her family's wealth and status. When the manor was finally seized, Margaret would lose her job and her home, another casualty of Edmund's choices. The media attention surrounding the case was overwhelming. Charlotte watched from the manor's windows as news vans lined the entrance gates, reporters shouting questions at anyone who entered or left the property. The scandal had become a national story, with talking heads on cable news shows debating the implications of such extensive infiltration of American business and political circles. "Whitmore Industries exposed as front for foreign espionage ring," read one headline. "Dynasty built on treason. The fall of New England's first family," proclaimed another. Charlotte realized that even if she and Vivienne were cleared of criminal charges, they would carry the stigma of their family name for the rest of their lives. Professor Helena Morrison contacted Charlotte directly once the investigation became public, expressing her shock at learning about Edmund's activities and offering whatever support she could provide. The professor's encouragement to pursue legal education took on new meaning now. Charlotte realized she would need marketable skills to build a life independent of her family's tainted legacy. "I've been in contact with several law schools about your situation," Professor Morrison explained during a phone conversation. "There are scholarship programs available for students from unusual circumstances, and your academic record is strong enough to warrant serious consideration despite everything that's happened." The idea of starting over completely, of building a new identity based on her own achievements rather than inherited wealth, was both terrifying and liberating. Charlotte had always chafed against the restrictions of her privileged upbringing, and now she would have the chance to discover who she really was when stripped of all external advantages. Edmund's cooperation with federal investigators proved extensive and valuable. He provided detailed information about Victor's organization, their methods of operation, and their connections to foreign intelligence services. The debriefing sessions lasted for weeks, with Edmund revealing layer after layer of criminal activity that had been hidden beneath the veneer of legitimate business operations. The guard who had initially responded to the disturbance call at the manor, Detective Morrison, became something of a hero in the media coverage. His quick thinking and tactical awareness had prevented what could have been a massacre, saving the lives of the Whitmore family and preserving crucial evidence of the espionage ring. Charlotte learned that his name being similar to Professor Morrison's was indeed a coincidence, though one that had initially confused Victor's organization and possibly saved her life. As the investigation expanded, other prominent families and business leaders were implicated in the network. Victor's organization had been operating for decades, recruiting assets among America's social and business elite through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and ideological manipulation. The full scope of the damage to national security would take years to assess completely. Charlotte testified before a federal grand jury about her experiences on the night of the arrests, providing crucial evidence about Victor's threats and the organization's methods of operation. The experience was terrifying but also empowering. For the first time in her life, her voice and her words carried real weight in determining the outcome of something that mattered. Vivienne's recovery proved more difficult and prolonged. The psychological trauma of learning that their entire lives had been a lie, combined with the terror of that night in the library, had left her struggling with severe depression and anxiety. Charlotte became her sister's primary caretaker, helping her navigate therapy sessions and legal proceedings while trying to rebuild her own shattered sense of identity. The silence in Willowbrook Manor was always deceptive. Behind its Victorian walls and manicured gardens lay secrets that had festered for decades, secrets that would soon spill into the corridors like blood from a fresh wound. Charlotte Whitmore had always known her family's wealth came with a price, but she never imagined that price would be paid in screams that echoed through mahogany-paneled halls at 3 in the morning. On that fateful October night in 1987, when the autumn wind rattled the estate's ancient windows and the grandfather clock in the foyer struck midnight with ominous precision, Charlotte discovered that some doors should never be opened, some truths should never be spoken, and some families harbor darkness so profound it can consume everything in its path. What happened in the locked study that night would shatter a dynasty, expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, and transform a young woman's desperate cry for help into a battle cry for justice that would reverberate through courtrooms, newspaper headlines, and the collective conscience of a nation. This is not just a story of family betrayal or hidden fortunes. This is the true account of how one woman's courage to speak the unspeakable brought down an empire built on lies, and how a single guard's decision to break through that locked door changed the course of history forever. The October morning mist clung to the estate grounds like secrets to skin, and she could barely make out the figures moving between the carefully sculpted boxwood. At 23, she had lived her entire life within these walls, yet lately felt more trapped than protected by the imposing stone barriers that surrounded Willowbrook Manor. Edmund's cooperation earned him a reduced sentence of 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years. Charlotte visited him once before leaving Connecticut, finding him aged and broken by the weight of his crimes. He apologized repeatedly for the choices that had destroyed their family, but Charlotte wasn't sure forgiveness was possible for betrayals of such magnitude. "I thought I could control it," Edmund said during their final conversation, tears streaming down his face. "I thought I could take their money and give them just enough information to keep them satisfied without really damaging anything important. I was wrong about everything." Charlotte left the prison knowing she might never see her father again, the man who had raised her, who had provided for her, who had taught her to value education and achievement, had also been living a double life that put his own country and family at risk. Reconciling those contradictions would take years of therapy and self-reflection. As Charlotte drove west toward her new life, she thought about the night that had changed everything. The terror in the library, Victor's cold threats, the moment when Detective Morrison had arrived to save them, all of it felt like something that had happened to someone else. The privileged young woman who had lived in Willowbrook Manor was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that safety and security were never guaranteed, that trust had to be earned, and that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who posed the greatest danger. But Charlotte had also discovered reserves of strength and courage she hadn't known she possessed. She had spoken truth to power when it mattered most, had protected her sister when their world collapsed, and had chosen to rebuild rather than surrender to despair. The name Whitmore would always carry the stain of treason, but Charlotte was determined to create a new legacy built on justice rather than betrayal. Years later, as Charlotte graduated from law school and began her career as a federal prosecutor, specializing in financial crimes, she would look back on that night in the library as the moment her real life began. The cry that had echoed down the hall had been one of terror, but it had also been a cry for justice that would ultimately be answered. The estate sprawled across 200 acres of prime Connecticut countryside, its Gothic Revival architecture a testament to the Whitmore family's industrial fortune. Built in 1889 by her great-great-grandfather Cornelius Whitmore, the manor had housed 4 generations of her family, each adding their own layer to its complex history. The East Wing alone contained 37 rooms, most of which Charlotte had never entered, including the study that had remained locked for as long as she could remember. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, ruled the house with the same iron fist he used to control his business empire. Whitmore Industries had fingers in everything from textile manufacturing to government contracts, making the family one of the wealthiest in New England. Edmund's word was law within these walls, and that law dictated that Charlotte's role was to be seen, not heard, to smile at charity galas and look beautiful at business dinners, but never to ask questions about the source of their prosperity. Charlotte had always been different from what her father expected. While her younger sister Vivienne embraced the role of the pampered socialite, Charlotte possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond their gates. She devoured books in the manor's extensive library, teaching herself about law, history, and social justice. Her father tolerated this intellectual pursuit as long as it remained private, but Charlotte yearned for something more meaningful than the empty existence mapped out for her. The morning routine at Willowbrook never varied. Charlotte would dress in one of the conservative outfits selected by her personal maid, Margaret, then join the family for breakfast in the formal dining room. The room itself was a monument to excess, with its coffered ceiling, crystal chandelier, and portraits of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors staring down from oil paintings. The mahogany table could seat 20, though typically only the immediate family gathered there. Edmund sat at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 58, he maintained the commanding presence that had made him feared in boardrooms across the country. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing, and Charlotte had learned early in life to school her expressions when in his presence. To his right sat Charlotte's stepmother, Victoria, a former beauty queen who had married into the Whitmore fortune 15 years earlier. Victoria's relationship with Charlotte was cordial but distant, more concerned with maintaining her status as the lady of the manor than with genuine maternal affection. Vivienne, at 19, was the family favorite. She possessed their father's ruthless ambition but wrapped it in charm and grace that made her dangerous, in ways Charlotte was only beginning to understand. Where Charlotte questioned and challenged, Vivienne manipulated and maneuvered. She had inherited their father's talent for reading people's weaknesses and exploiting them, a skill that Edmund praised as business acumen. That particular morning, the family discussion centered around the upcoming charity auction that Victoria was organizing. The event would bring together the most influential families in the state, providing networking opportunities disguised as philanthropy. Charlotte listened with growing frustration as they debated which artists to feature and which politicians to invite, all while completely ignoring the actual cause they claimed to support. "Charlotte, you've been awfully quiet this morning," Edmund observed, his voice carrying that edge of warning she knew well. "I trust you remember your role at Saturday's event. The Blackwood family will be attending, and their son Marcus has expressed interest in getting to know you better." The library door opened with a sharp knock, and Detective Ray Morrison stepped into the room, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Charlotte's heart nearly stopped when she heard the detective's name, Morrison. Guessing it's ill circumstance under Ed Nostin. Was this some kind of coincidence? Or was there a connection to Professor Helena Morrison that she hadn't understood? Detective Morrison was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s with graying temples and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His presence filled the library with an authority that immediately challenged Victor's control of the situation. Charlotte noticed how his gaze swept the room, cataloging the positions of everyone present, the expensive recording equipment that was still running, and the obvious tension that crackled through the air like electricity. "Mr. Whitmore," Detective Morrison said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of suspicion. "We received a call about a disturbance at your residence. Multiple reports of shouting, breaking glass, and what sounded like gunshots. Would you mind explaining what's been happening here tonight?" Charlotte watched as Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The detective's question suggested that someone had indeed witnessed the violent confrontation earlier in the evening, which meant Victor's plan to dismiss this as a simple business disagreement was already compromised. Edmund cleared his throat nervously, glancing at Victor before responding. "Detective Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. We've been having a business meeting that became rather heated, but I assure you that no one has been harmed." Detective Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. And these gentlemen are?" He gestured toward Victor and his associates. "Business partners," Edmund said quickly. "We were discussing some international contracts, and I'm afraid tempers got the better of us." Charlotte's stomach churned at the mention of Marcus Blackwood. The 28-year-old heir to a shipping fortune was exactly the kind of man her father considered an ideal match. Wealthy, connected, and completely willing to treat her as a beautiful accessory to his life rather than a person with her own thoughts and dreams. "Of course, father," Charlotte replied carefully, knowing that any show of resistance would result in consequences she wasn't prepared to face, not yet. After breakfast, Charlotte excused herself to the library, her favorite refuge within the manor. The two-story room housed over 10,000 volumes, collected by generations of Whitmores. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves stretched toward a painted ceiling that depicted classical scenes of justice and wisdom. Persian rugs covered the polished hardwood floors, and comfortable leather chairs were positioned near tall windows that provided natural light for reading. Charlotte had claimed a corner desk as her own personal workspace, where she kept her private journals and correspondence. She had been secretly corresponding with Professor Helena Morrison at Yale University, a woman who had become something of a mentor despite their never having met in person. Professor Morrison taught constitutional law and had been encouraging Charlotte to consider applying to law school, something that would be absolutely forbidden if her father discovered it. As Charlotte settled into her routine of reading and writing, she became aware of unusual activity outside the library windows. Several black sedans had pulled up the circular driveway, and men in expensive suits were being escorted toward the main entrance. This wasn't entirely unusual. Her father frequently conducted business at the manor, but something about the urgency of their movements and the grim expressions on their faces suggested this wasn't a typical meeting. Margaret appeared in the library doorway, looking more flustered than Charlotte had ever seen her. The elderly woman had been with the family for over 20 years and typically maintained an unflappable demeanor regardless of the circumstances. "Miss Charlotte," Margaret said, wringing her hands nervously, "your father requests that you remain in the library for the remainder of the day. He's asked that meals be brought to you here, and under no circumstances are you to leave this room until he personally escorts you out." Charlotte looked up from her book, alarmed by the unusual request. "Is everything all right, Margaret? Who are those men with father?" Margaret's eyes darted toward the windows, then back to Charlotte. "I'm sure it's nothing to concern yourself with, dear. Just some business associates. Please, just do as your father asks. It's very important." After Margaret left, Charlotte tried to focus on her reading, but concentration proved impossible. The muffled sounds of intense conversation drifted through the manor's walls, occasionally punctuated by raised voices or the sound of doors slamming. Whatever was happening in her father's private study, it was clearly significant. As the afternoon wore on, Charlotte's anxiety grew. She had been effectively imprisoned in the library, something that had never happened before. Even during her teenage years, when she had tested her father's patience with various acts of rebellion, she had never been confined to a single room. The fact that he felt the need to isolate her suggested that whatever business was being conducted involved information that could be dangerous for her to overhear. The library windows faced the front of the estate, giving Charlotte a clear view of the main entrance and circular driveway. Throughout the afternoon, she watched as more vehicles arrived and departed. Charlotte had been confined to the library for nearly 12 hours, and still no word from her father about when she might be released. She was beginning to consider the possibility that she might spend the entire night in the library when she heard footsteps approaching. The library door opened to reveal her father, but he looked nothing like the composed businessman who had presided over breakfast that morning. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Most unsettling of all was the expression on his face, a mixture of anger, fear, and something else that Charlotte couldn't quite identify. "Charlotte," he said, his voice hoarse from hours of intense conversation, "I need to speak with you about some changes that will be taking place in our family's circumstances." Charlotte closed her book and gave her father her full attention, sensing that whatever he was about to tell her would fundamentally alter her understanding of their world. The manor felt different around them, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. Edmund closed the library door behind him and activated a lock that Charlotte hadn't even known existed. The soft click of the mechanism engaging sent a chill down her spine. For the first time in her life, she found herself truly afraid of her own father. "What I'm about to tell you must never leave this room," Edmund began, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the consequences of disobedience would be severe. "Our family's survival depends on your absolute discretion and cooperation." Charlotte nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to demand answers to the questions that had been building all day. Why the secrecy? Why the lock on the door? And most importantly, what had her father done that required such extreme measures to conceal? Edmund began pacing in front of the fireplace, His hands clasped behind his back in a gesture Charlotte recognized as his way of buying time before delivering difficult news. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, making his expression even more difficult to read than usual. "Charlotte, you've always been the curious one," he said finally. "Always asking questions, always wanting to understand things that are frankly beyond your concern. That curiosity, while admirable in some respects, has become a liability that we can no longer afford." The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Her own father was essentially telling her that her intelligence and desire to understand the world made her a threat to the family. The implication was clear. She would need to choose between her natural inclinations and her place in the Whitmore dynasty. "I don't understand," Charlotte said carefully. "How is my curiosity a liability?" Edmund stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that made her blood run cold. "Because, my dear daughter, there are aspects of our business that require absolute confidentiality. The men who were here today represent interests that value discretion above all else. They have made it clear that any potential security risks must be eliminated." The word eliminated hung in the air between them like a sword. Charlotte's mind raced with the implications of her father's statement. Was he suggesting that she posed a risk to some kind of illegal business operation? And if so, what did eliminated mean in this context? Before Charlotte could respond, the sound of breaking glass shattered the tense silence. Somewhere in the manor, something had gone terribly wrong. The manor was finally seized by federal marshals 6 months after the arrests. Charlotte and Vivian were given 1 day to collect their remaining personal belongings before being escorted from the only home they had ever known. Standing on the front steps where she had played as a child, Charlotte looked back at the imposing structure that had represented everything her family stood for. The Gothic windows that had once seemed grand now looked hollow and haunting. The carefully maintained grounds had already begun to show signs of neglect, with weeds creeping through the flower beds and leaves gathering in the fountain. Within a few years, Willowbrook Manor would either be demolished or converted into government offices. Its role as the seat of a criminal empire finally ended. Agent Chen provided Charlotte and Vivienne with new identities and relocation assistance, recognizing that their cooperation with the investigation had made them potential targets for revenge by what remained of Victor's organization. Charlotte chose to move to a small college town in Oregon, where she could attend law school under an assumed name while maintaining some distance from the media attention that still followed the case. Professor Morrison helped arrange Charlotte's admission to a respected law program, along with a scholarship that would cover her tuition and living expenses. For the first time in her life, Charlotte would be entirely dependent on her own abilities rather than her family's wealth. The prospect was intimidating, but also oddly freeing. Viktor Kozlov was ultimately convicted on charges of espionage, racketeering, and conspiracy. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again threaten national security or innocent families like the Whitmores. His organization was dismantled, though investigators suspected that other similar networks continued to operate.